Well, thank you very much. Before I start, I also want to thank, of course, Nancy Lee and Jonathan Kemper, who have the link with Smithsonian here, the Linda Hall Library. I greatly appreciate the invitation. Eric Ward here gave me a call many, many months ago, and we were talking about this, and I did jump at the opportunity, if and only if I could talk before David McCullough talked. So thank you for making sure that I got to do that. And I'm glad he's not here today. I'm going to talk to you about research we're doing in the Panama Canal Watershed. And as Lisa said, we're studying the ecosystem services that are provided by tropical forests and how they change with land use and climate change. Big focus on the Panama Canal Watershed. It gives us at some level an excuse to talk about the world, but we're looking at scaling up. I need to point out that this is a collaboration with a lot of different institutions. We could not do our work without really close collaboration with the Panama Canal Authority and the National Ministry for the Environment. So we're very fortunate on that. I should also mention that, of course, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute is part of the Smithsonian. So we're really your institute. I mean, we receive substantial funding from the federal government and then private donors. And of course, the Smithsonian has over in Washington, D.C., over 30 million visitors a year, and there's a big effort in educational programs and making an effort to reach the rest of the country. So we're part of that, and hopefully I'll be able to make the argument of why there should be a Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and if I don't, we can talk about that after this. So on we go. One of the strategic advantages, if you will, about the Smithsonian and STRI in Panama is this notion that, 94% of the top universities in the world are in the temperate zone. But if you care about biodiversity, over 80% of the estimated biodiversity is in the tropics. And so we're in the tropics, and all of the staff scientists, there's 40 of us there, and there's about 400 people working at STRI. We're all close to these ecosystems we're studying, and we have really nice facilities where we're able to get there. And Smithsonian has been in Panama for 100 years, over 100 years. We were invited with biological explorations with the expansion, or the construction of the Panama Canal, and we didn't leave. But we were allowed to stay, but I wasn't there 100 years ago, obviously. And so the mission, if you will, of STRI, the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, which plays off, of course, the 4 grand challenges of Smithsonian, is really the increase in diffusion of knowledge, the past, present, future of tropical biodiversity. And we look at biodiversity from all aspects, including evolutionary biology, and its relevance to human welfare. And so there's a lot of curiosity-driven science at STRI that the relevance directly to applied aspects might not be obvious, but the links are there, and we need basic research, of course, in order to understand the world. So the STRI platform on the isthmus, if you will, we have 13 facilities, and in case you don't know, Panama basically runs east-west. Panama City is here on the south, on the Pacific, and then the north, the Panama Canal runs this way, north to south or south to north, and the Panama Canal Watershed is basically here, and Agua Salud Project. I will talk alternatively perhaps about the Agua Salud Project and the Panama Canal Watershed Experiment. The Agua Salud Project is really where our focal research area is, which would be right here on the banks of the Panama Canal Watershed. So the commerce side of this is we have to convince anybody about the importance, the global importance of the Panama Canal Watershed. Really, it's arguably the world's most important inland commercial waterway. 4.5% of all global trade goes through the Panama Canal. Some 40% of the goods that come from Asia that go to the east coast of the United States pass through the Panama Canal. There are lots of goods that come from South America and even from the west coast of the United States that pass through the canal to the east and to Europe and all that. So it's quite a big deal. There are 14,000 ships that pass through the canal each year, and each one of them uses 200,000 cubic meters of water. So there's a lot of water that's taken to run this canal. The Panama Canal Authority points out, and with rightfully so, that for those of us concerned about climate change and global change and increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, every time a ship doesn't go around South America, there's a carbon savings, if you will, and carbon dioxide emission by going through the canal. So big importance in global commerce. These are the locks on the Gatun side, of course. And you can see in the wonderful exhibit here, part of the engineering success of the canal is not having sea level canal, but raising the ships high and creating Gatun Lake and sending them across the isthmus. The sea level canal was what Fernando Lesseps was trying and didn't work, but largely because of medical reasons in part. But as I said, there's 14,000 ships that go through here a year, about 39 a day, and the Panama Canal generates $2 billion in revenue a year, and of which they now give $1 billion a year to the Treasury of Panama. But at some level, that's only the scratching. It's not scratching the surface, but it's part of what it is, because the logistics economy that's also grown up about this, the first free trade zone in Latin America here on the Colón side, allows for all of these other knock-on businesses. And so it really is an engine of the economy of Panama. And you may have heard something about the expansion of the canal. These are the gates that were made in Italy. They're here. This is that same Gatun lock over here. And this is the expansion here, the new locks on the Gatun side. And the new ships that go through the canal will carry almost, so the biggest ship that can go through the Panama Canal is called a Panamax, and it's an international shipping standard, if you will. These post-Panamax vessels that will go through this new locks here, they will carry almost 3 times as much cargo as the vessels that go through here. For those of us who are interested in studying water and hydrology, which we're doing, the Panama Canal Authority will point out that these new locks here, they're going to be more water use efficient. But that means that they're going to use 93% of the locks, the original locks, which they're not talking about closing these other 2 locks. So in a sense, they need almost a third as much water if they're going to run this whole thing at capacity. So that's of note and maybe worth considering the stress on the ecosystem. If you come to Panama, and it's dry in Panama, we get 1,500 visiting scientists and postdoctoral fellows and students a year. So we have lots of visitors. In the middle of the Panama Canal Watershed, we have Barrow, Colorado Island, which we manage on behalf of the government as a monument, national monument. And it's a scientific study area. We've done it since the 1920s. If you come there, like so many forest ecologists do, and so many people have come, they want to study the big, beautiful, mature forest, not the messy, landscape. But if you come to Tocumen International Airport, go through Panama City and drive out, you'll go through the former canal zone, which is largely forested, and go out to BCI if you're going there, and you'll see all this wonderful forest, and you'll think, well, the whole watershed is forested, isn't this great? Great playground for a tropical biologist, but of course that's not really the case. This is a map of the Panama Canal Watershed in black here. This would be this forested area here. This, of course, is the canal going through here, and Barrow, Colorado Island National Monument, or BCI, is right here. So this dotted line are transits for ships. Panama City here is a big urban area, of course. But we have parks, a big national park here, Chagres National Park. Soberania National Park here is this area that used to be the U.S. controlled zone has been converted into national parks. It's forested. But all of this, so about half of the watershed is forested. And about half it isn't, that means. And about 25% of the watershed is in cattle pasture. So there's lots of different land uses. There's a big urbanization front going along this road here. All these red dots here are areas where people live. They're towns. So a lot of people live here. And in the Panama Canal watershed, fully 1/2 of the population of the country of Panama gets their drinking water from the Panama Canal watershed. So the Panama Canal Authority is charged with managing water in the watershed. They don't have any sticks, so they have no enforcement capacity, but they will tell you that the first and foremost thing they do is manage for clean drinking water. So it's not as much water, but it's obviously very important. And of course that drives the economy too, because if you can't have a business there, if people don't have drinking water, you're kind of in trouble. So, and in Panama City you can go there, and it's one of these, in a certain sense, rare tropical countries where you can drink water straight out of the tap. And it comes largely from Alajuela Lake here, which the construction of Madden Dam here, Madden Dam is up here anyway, on the Chagres River that flows here. This Alajuela Lake is an artificial lake that's a reservoir for running the canal during the dry season, but also it's where the drinking water comes from. And it was dammed in, I think, about late 30s or 40s there. And of course, Gatun Lake is an artificial lake too. There's now some drinking water going to cities down here from the canal as well. So rapid urbanization here is a challenge. There are some national parks here. There's a lot of people that live here, a lot of stakeholders, if you will, if you want to manage the land. It's important. And for those of us interested in water, about 80% of the water that goes into the Panama Canal comes from this eastern side of the Panama Canal. So if you're interested, as we are, in studying tropical hydrology and water for the canal, it makes sense to be on that eastern side. And our focal research area, which I'll talk a lot about, the Agua Salud project, is in here. And we're on the same soils and geology, for those interested, as much of this upper Chagres area, and that's important to allow us to do simple extrapolations before we are able to go a lot further. So land use in Panama, yep, there's in the watershed, there's forest, there's this invasive canal grass. It's 4+ meters tall. It's a sugarcane relative. Actually, they breed it with sugarcane to make it more robust. Cattle pasture, as I said, is a big land use. Plantations, there were predicted to be a lot more plantations than there are, but there's about 2% of the watershed is in plantations. And this secondary forest and secondary succession, all of these are in our focal site that we're studying. So for this part of the talk, I want to approach the studies that we do from this idea of land management. And so having been to a forestry school, they did teach us that if you want to manage land, first thing, when you manage anything, you got to define your management objectives. And one of the big challenges in land management, you have lots of stakeholders sitting around the table, is that people have many objectives. Conservationists want to have maybe all forest, and they don't necessarily articulate these kinds of things. Whereas we're not charged with managing the watershed, we do study it, and it's useful to approach this from management objectives and from individual ecosystem services, if you will, in the watershed. And of course, water is king. As I said, drinking water for half the people of Panama, the 14,000 ships that go through the canal, I don't even know how many they're predicting in the new locks, because as part of the expansion, currently there's one-way traffic through this Culebra cut that goes through the center of the canal, but with the expansion, they're going to have two-way traffic. So more locks, more ships, a lot of water, each ship using 200,000 cubic meters is a lot. So too little water can be a real big problem. And this is not from the Panama Canal Watershed, this is from Lake Bayano, but it's from 2013, just a couple years ago. At the end of the dry season, it is also an artificial lake that generates much of the electricity for Panama City, and all of this should be underwater. And so Lake Bayano was in May of 2013 was drying up, and there was an energy crisis in Panama City. There wasn't enough energy produced by hydropower to do everything that people need in Panama City. The government decided in their wisdom to close the schools. I was a little annoyed. My kids were home. They didn't close the casinos. They didn't close the big malls, but they closed the schools. Okay, there you go. But it's a big problem. So too little water is a big problem. And there have been years when the Panama Canal has had to have draft restrictions. So they had to, shippers before they got to the canal were told they couldn't have as much cargo because they could get through the canal. So this would be under a very severe drought or El Nino year, a severe El Nino year. So managing for this too little water is important. Last year we also had an energy crisis in Panama City. It was alleviated through buying from other sources of energy, fossil fuel generated energy. In tropical hydrology, one of the biggest questions, and many people think it's solved and are surprised to see this as a question, the idea is the forest a sponge? Does a forest in the tropics in a seasonal climate and its soil and below ground infrastructure, if you will, does it absorb water in the wet season, somehow store it and release it during the dry season? And there's lots of conservation NGOs that are around going out there, some that I used to work for, that are selling reforestation in the tropics because of this sponge effect, because we need to restore this dry season water. Amongst tropical hydrologists, it's absolutely not settled. And the reason is because you have to have long-term studies, and not so simple. And this is one of the big things that we're getting at. Of course, to some degree, in the Panama Canal watershed, the dry season water is worth its weight in gold, or it's much more valuable commodity than it is during the wet season when you can have too much water, which we'll talk about as well. So how might the sponge work? Well, a forest, a tree, this below ground infrastructure, all the roots, all the earthworms, and all the insects and burrowing animals create these large flow paths, these macropores, and allows water to absorb faster into the soil versus a cattle pasture, which is highly compact and may not have that. This might be how it how it works. In our focal research project that I pointed out the area to, this whole area over here, this is part of Soberania National Park. It's all forested. We are fortunate to have donors who purchased this land for our use that's outlined here in yellow. We have a number of different watersheds. So one of the ways to get at this idea of the sponge effect is to look at a forested watershed. And it's kind of hard to see this one here and compare it to, say, a cattle pasture and measure it over a bunch of years. And you have per hectare more water in the forested watershed during the dry season than the deforested area. Well, then you might have a sponge effect. And we're trying to measure that, and in some sense it's relatively simple, but it's certainly not trivial. But we're trying to also then get at the mechanisms of how the ecosystem might function to produce this. And then if it exists, and we'll also talk about some of the other benefits of forests or not, we want to know if we can reconstitute those services, if you will, provided by forests. And so we have a teak plantation, and it's not because teak is exotic, well, that's fine, but it's not because we're trying to learn how to grow teak in Panama. People have been managing teak in plantations for, well, actually learned from a colleague at University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, the other day, that where he's from in India, they actually have plantations that are 150 years old. So people have been growing teak in plantations for a long time. We're not trying to solve that problem, but 75% of the trees that are planted in Panama are teak. So we understand how that works with the hydrological cycle and carbon sequestration and other things. We have a native species plantation here, watershed. This would be a watershed. Is a native species plantation more efficient than maybe teak in restoring these hydrological values or not, if they exist, first of all? And then we have a secondary forest catchment. We've put in a new silvopastoral catchment here, so that's instead of this cattle pasture that has no trees on it, you're planting trees in association with it. There's a lot of economic benefits to it, and a shade coffee one here. And these three watersheds are financed by the Panama Canal Authority. I mean, they're doing extension efforts in this and trying to convince or encourage people to convert their land into these kind of land uses without necessarily knowing for sure that they produce these water-related benefits that they're hoping to have. And so what we're doing in a certain sense is and this is idealistic because it's not perfect what we're doing, but we're trying to measure, in a sense, every drop of rain that comes in. So, the rainfall or rain gauge networks all across this area, and where it goes. So water can hit the forest canopy and it can re-evaporate immediately, and that's called interception. Or it can fall through the canopy and hit the ground. That's called throughfall. Where does it go once it hits the ground? It can roll over land as overland flow to a stream, or it can infiltrate into the soil, and it can move in base flow, or it can leave through the trees in evapotranspiration. So we're trying to close this hydrological cycle so that we know where the water is going, and we know that we have these stream flow differences. And so we have these weirs, all these little dams where water is controlled all over the watershed, carefully measuring it. And then we're also using experimental tracers. Colleagues here are using tracers where they're able to map with, they really get upset with me when I call it a sprinkler system, but these are rainfall simulators. Where actually they have computers where they can dial up any level of storm they want and have the rain droplets be the same size as a tropical storm. It's the thing scientists do, I'm telling you, outside of my field. And then use chemical tracers to get a 3D map of how the water moves through the soil, because this is one of the missing components of hydrological models, really, that are out there. So in terms of the sponge effect, on an average year, this is not actually an average year. This is a colleague of mine, Bob Stollard, who's also at the U.S. Geological Survey. This is his data from that forested and pasture or deforested catchments. This is runoff would be stream flow. This yellow line would be the stream flow over the rainy season. This is the rainy season, dry season boundary. Stream flow over the course of most of the year. This is the deforested catchment, the stream flow over the course of the year. And so you can see that, well, if you have a cattle pasture, there's the water's not going to be used by the trees. There's not evapotranspiration, so you have more stream flow at that time of year. But as I'll talk to you later, too much water can also actually be a big problem. So the forest uses water for growth. Okay, that's great, photosynthesis and all that. But then we have a crossing of the lines during this year, and there's more water in the forested stream than there is in the deforested stream. And so the integration of this area between here, that would be that benefit of a sponge effect. And so in the 90s, late 90s, Bob was able to show this. Since we started our project, we've actually shown that we have a sponge effect and published a paper, but the wettest year we've had in our watersheds has been 300 millimeters of rain above average, and the driest year. The wettest year was the wettest year on record in 150 years of record keeping in Panama. So we're not trying to get a sponge in an ever wet forest, because we know we won't get that, but we need a more severe dry season to help us understand how that works. But so there, we've been able to show a sponge effect. And then, as I said, this idea of too much water here, or this water can also be a problem. And this is an image of Gatun Dam, which is on the Gatun Lake, northern part of Cologne. During this flood of record, La Purísima, as they named it. So we were at the end of what was already on track to be the wettest year of record, and we had this really big storm. In our catchments, we had 500 millimeters in just a couple of days of rainfall. And the Panama Canal Authority will manage that Alajuela Lake, that artificial lake above Gatun Lake. They try to fill it and have it absolutely full at the end of the dry season, or into the wet season, I'm sorry. So then they have this big storage for dry season water. But the biggest and most unpredictable storms come at the end of the wet season. So getting that just right is a challenge. So during La Purísima was really the fourth time ever, but the first time ever since that Madden Dam in Alajuela Lake has been built, that they actually had to close the canal for environmental reason. They closed it for 17 hours. The water coming through the Gatun and Madden Dam on Alajuela was at the specifications that the dams were built to help. They're absolutely at capacity. And the Panama Canal Authority during this time opened up the locks. So they just tried to, all the storm floodgate, everything, to try to evacuate as much water as fast as they could, because their infrastructure was at risk. And so this is not an average year. Okay, fine. But when you have these dams, at specs, and then if we take our data from our deforested catchment and our forested catchment, take the difference and extrapolate them up to that forested watershed above Alajuela Lake, the difference is on the order of 100 million cubic meters of water difference. And so a back of the envelope calculation suggests that if that whole area had been deforested, we might have had 100 million additional cubic meters hitting these dams that were absolutely at the capacity of everything they were built to take. And as I like to say, even if you don't know what a cubic meter is, 100 million of anything has to be a lot, right? So imagine that, and it's possible those dams would have been blown to New Orleans. And once you imagine how many hundreds of millions of dollars it would take to build these new dams, that's a big deal. But also then we're told that even once they rebuild these things, it takes 4 years to fill the canal with water. So global commerce would have taken it on the chin for sure, and the economy of the U.S. would be, with all this East Coast goods and things, would have been a big problem. And so these are the things that people have to take in effect. And of course, the predictions of climate change and the IPCC's reports are that more severe and unpredictable weather events will happen, be them droughts or storms. So just because this is a 100-year flood doesn't mean that the next 100 years this is what what would happen then. So that was a pretty interesting data that a lot of people are really quite interested in. So we've shown that there's a sponge effect. We've shown this effect of the forests in diminishing these peak floods and events. We want to understand how it all works, because their colleagues are trying to build these hydrological models that will allow them to predict in the future for climate change and land use change. And then we also want to see is, can we have these sponge effect and the other infiltration benefits? Can we reconstruct this, and what's the most efficient way, if you will, to reconstruct it? Another objective that's out in the forefront, of course, is with climate change, is the idea that we all, you hear that somewhere between 10 and 15% of carbon dioxide annually that's released in the atmosphere is from land use change in the tropics, from deforestation or something of that order. And people are talking about planting trees to sequester carbon, to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, to mitigate the rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we're spending a lot of time at Smithsonian in our project trying to understand the carbon cycle, if you will, and trying to understand the benefits of forests in that way. And so here we have our different land use. Tropical forests we've been studying at Smithsonian for a long time. Our project, of course, we're studying all of this other mixed land use in this respect and others. How are we doing it? These are the same yellow lines that we had before, the land that we're working on. And I should have mentioned, we're really fortunate. We set up a project that's going to last up to 40 years. I mean, as scientists, it's not all funded for 40 years, of course, but you don't, usually as a scientist, you're really, really fortunate if you get a 3-year grant, right? So setting it up, and that's the great thing about Smithsonian, is having the staying power and the vision to start some of these long-term studies. And that's why people haven't dammed these other rivers and figured out this sponge effect because it takes a long time to look at it. Well, they're a little washed out, but there's a lot of orange squares here. Maybe you can see them better than I can here. And we have plots. We have forest plots all through this area. These squares here, this is our native species plantations that I'll talk about in a little bit. But from all of these plots, here's these forested plots that really focuses on the first 30 years of forest growth, of regeneration after taking cattle off of it. We measure all these trees annually. We're trying to understand how the forest reorganizes itself, but we're also figuring out how much carbon is in those forests. And so people have worked in the mature forest for a long time. We've developed our own allometric equations, so the equations that we use to figure out how much carbon is in those forests, because the mature forest equations don't work in secondary forest. And what do we have? This is just some data from, this is the forest succession. And amazingly, in the first 20 years, you can have 50 tons or more carbon accumulation in the system, and that's really rapid growth. When a mature forest only has about 125 tons, that's pretty amazing. And we're next to a mature forest. We don't have issues of seed dispersal. We have lots of trees and species getting there. And on the mechanistic side, and I'm not going to go, I'll just mention this to you. And we have colleagues, we've been looking at different guilds of trees, and we were able to show the importance of what we call nitrogen fixers, trees that can take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into biologically useful nitrogen. And it's these nitrogen fixers. Without this guild of species, there isn't enough nitrogen in the system to allow for this really rapid growth of forests. So that's getting at the mechanisms of that, and colleagues at Princeton University are putting these into these global Earth system models, these functional nitrogen fixers. So we've measured this, and we're trying to figure out what it means. We use this also then working with a colleague, Greg Asner from the Carnegie Airborne Observatory. He uses a LIDAR, which is basically a laser flown from an airplane that allows you to measure the carbon, among other things, in a forest. You can just fly over it. We've helped him ground his not allometric equations, but his algorithm to figure out how much carbon is in a forest. And then we all published, Greg being the first author, a map, the first countrywide study of map. How much carbon is in the whole country, where it is, and how is it used. And so for this, you may or may not have heard of these UN efforts and the climate change talks and the idea of trading of carbon credits and RED, the reduced emissions due to deforestation, land degradation. Part of the problem with selling carbon credits in a forest is you have to have repeatability of measurements. So if I go out there and put a plot out there and measure, let's say 100 tons this year, in 5 years I get 200 tons. Well, is that because of my measurement error? Maybe we were all drunk or something next time around and doing something, or too much coffee, or that's the repeatability. In order to sell these things, you have to know that the change is due to not to measurement error, but to growth of the trees, or not. And the nice thing about this is there's less than a 10% error with this LIDAR method, which means it's repeatable, which means that it can be used as a technology for carbon trading. So we're working with them on that. Smart reforestation, Nancy mentioned it. Smart reforestation, if you will, yes, it's kind of a buzzword phrase, but the idea, like so many others, we're looking for win-win solutions, if you will, to land management in the tropics, or in an era of rapid change, of global change. And that can be intelligent land use planning, the spatial juxtaposition of different land uses for whatever goods and services we want, but also trying to get the mechanisms of how trees interact in order to produce those services. And here's an example. This is not, I don't think, in your exhibit, but this is a map of the Panama Canal and Panama City. This is Panama City about 1920. This is the Bay of Panama. If you go there now, with skyscrapers everywhere, right? But what's interesting is through this area of the canal, this lighter area that's all through here, this is all deforested. It's all deforested area. And this image here was taken basically in that same area, this that I've started out the talk with. And so, smart reforestation can be as simple as, well, if there are seed sources for the trees to allow the trees to, disperse in there and regenerate, you just protect the area. And at that level, as long as the forest soil is not so badly abused and degraded, then it can recover on its own. And it's a lot less expensive than trying to plant trees. One of the big challenges to that in this day and age is trying to keep fire out, but that's an issue. So that could be an example. We also approach this then from the idea that you know, was a couple of years ago, the UN, announced that we had over 7 billion people living on the Earth, and we're projected to have over 11 billion sometime this century. And so at a certain level, it just makes sense that in order to feed all of those people, the good soils are going to go to agriculture. I mean, you got to do that. And so reforestation efforts, we would argue, are going to be more and more pushed, especially when it amounts to carbon, on these infertile or highly degraded soils. And so the real challenge is figuring out at some level, how do you reboot an ecosystem, if you will? How do you when nutrient cycling and water cycling has collapsed? And so, as most foresters know, this is biomass or above ground, the weight of a forest above the ground. This is time in years. This is just an idea. If you have an infertile site, a given tree species may grow this some level much lower than on a fertile soil at the same time period. And so, what we're trying to do is that, how do we take, on the infertile site, really, this is a monoculture, so these would be trees that are heavily competing with each other, same tree, same roots and above ground and all that kind of attributes. But how can you take that and how can you bump it up to get some sort of a mixture to get faster growth or better growth over time? And this would be for biomass, could be carbon, could be infiltration of water into the soils or whatever you want. We're trying to, it's very ambitious and we're not there yet, but that's what we're working on. I've inherited a project called ProRena, which is a native species reforestation project, and we've screened, there's 2,000 flowering plant species in Panama. We've screened 75 of them, which we think is pretty good, but across this rainfall, and which is also a soil fertility matrix, 50,000 trees grown here, and just trying to learn what might grow well where. And that's why people plant in the tropics basically 4 species or genera of trees. They plant teak, they plant eucalyptus, they plant pines, and they plant acacias. And in many places they're exotic. And so, people say, well, why don't you plant native species? Well, if it costs, and it does, between $5,000 and $10,000 a hectare to plant and manage anything in a plantation in Panama over 20 years, if you have a catastrophic failure, that's really expensive, especially hundreds or thousands of hectares at that kind of price. So that's why people they know something about teak and these other things. So we're trying to learn how to grow and manage these native species and what ones might be profitable or whatever. And this is just a big map. This is just a bunch of data, right? It's just to prove to you that over these different sites, all these data points are plots, and we have lots of different trees, and these would be mean height growths of all the area, in any given area. And so you have red lines that are the mean of any of these species at a site, or they're above or below. So we have a lot of data, and we're putting out scientific papers and field guides that help practitioners to learn about that. But we've used this data in our own native species plantation. So here's a native species watershed, but we need replication for scientific rigor. So we have these 2 blocks here for our native species plantations, and this would be when we plant it, and we were sweating bullets to do this, so that's why I keep showing this. But we planted 100,000 trees, and everyone had to be exactly his or her hole. That year was tough, big thing. So in our catchment here, then, if you will, we're using timber species. They're also, for scientists, they're all long-lived pioneers as well. And the reason we're using timber species, native timber, is because it costs so much to reforest that unless you're like the Panama Canal Authority or some big institution, you just can't afford to plant that unless you're going to get some money out of it, especially when you do it on a large scale. And so we've used that ProRena data set I showed you. We picked our trees. We know a lot about them, including their rooting morphology, their above ground growth, their water use efficiency, and we're trying to see that if in these mixtures here, can we do better than in these monocultures at these sites. And then, every combination of those 5 timber species is in a 2-species mixture. We have them at 5-species plots. We have these companion species. And let me show you what that looks like. This would be a monoculture plot. Well, okay, they're all orange dots. This is Picura cannata or Cedro spino. It's a commonly known timber tree, certainly harvested out of the mature forest, and people have been growing it in plantations for a couple decades. And then we have here, in this example of 2-species mixture, Dalbergia retusa, which is cocobolo. So cocobolo is a craft wood that people make statues out of. There's an illegal trade in cocobolo in Panama that's been likened to the drug trade, if you can believe that. I mean, think of all the cocaine coming through Central America. But there have been whole dozens of containers of this stuff that have been stopped at the port in Panama City that have been marked scrap metal, that are being sent to Asia. So there really is a big illegal trade. And if the press is right, this stuff is worth $4,000 a cubic meter. So the best commercial teak in Panama is worth $600 a cubic meter. And most teak in Panama is not worth near that much. So if it's worth up to $4,000 a cubic meter, well, it's worth maybe poaching. It's also worth trying to figure out how to grow it, right? So we have cocobola in our plantations, and we did that before we knew how valuable it was. And so what's unique about our plantations here is if we have a Pachira cannata here in the middle, we're completely encircling it by cocobola, and vice versa. So we can isolate these interactions here between trees, and we can really get at the mechanisms of how they compete for water or nutrients or cycle nutrients. Cocobola also has the feature of being a nitrogen fixer, so maybe it's capturing atmospheric nitrogen, converting it to biological nitrogen, cycling it into the ecosystem when it loses its leaves and fine roots, and maybe its neighbors picking it up. So we're doing lots of detailed studies on that, or as many as we can afford, and we have a lot planned. A 5-species mixture, and then the other thing would be this idea of the companion species, and these were chosen. We have 5 species here, and they're nitrogen fixers as well, or they cycle phosphorus, or they do more leaf litter, so they could incorporate organic matter into the soil. So the idea is to try to look at improving water flux. And if you were thinking about a plantation, well, in a plantation, of course, you're gonna thin a plantation over time anyway. So if we ended up, maybe these trees would do their job in the first decade, for example, and we cut them, and then we harvest these crop trees later. Could be that. In the 2003, a woman named Virginia Dale from Oak Ridge National Lab and all her collaborators published a paper which had a baseline of carbon in the Panama Canal Watershed. This is the map that they have. So this is that Upper Chagres watershed I was talking about. If we artificially deforested experimentally, what would happen? The national park here. And so there's lots of little patches of forest, and this is basically, the yellow is basically a deforested area, or very, very young secondary forest. And what they predicted that by 2020, that the watershed would look something like this. And the red here, this is urbanization. And so this would be urban fronts moving there. And this is what they called their new road scenario. And in fact, that's what we're living in, where the government of Panama paved a whole toll road, south to north, north to south from Panama City, and also kept the other road open. So there's urbanization front. But the other thing they predicted is all this area, we'd have all these plantations all over the whole area, because there are incentives. You can get a reforestation visa if you come to Panama. They'll give you a visa to stay long-term if you put X number of dollars into reforestation. You can get a tax break for reforestation. So they figured, well, people will do this here. This is a good place to do it. It's on that eastern side of the watershed where most of the water comes from. But the problem is that it didn't happen. This is 2008, but if we had a more recent, we're in 2014 now, I know it's not 2008, more recent image, it would be about the same, and there's a lot. So here's the new road. It's the plantations. There's a few little plantations here and there. There's the biggest one is here, Ecoforest on this side, but it really hasn't taken off even today. It doesn't look any different than this today. And why did that not happen? Is because of this. This is a growth curve that foresters use for site indexes of trees, and this is for teak in Central America and the Caribbean. And a site index of 1 is really good, and a site index of 5 is, why did I waste my money? And our own Agua Salud teak plantation, which we didn't expect them to grow well, comes in here at a good solid 4.5 here on this site index curve. And so our management objective there is we've did a lot of fertilization and a lot of liming the soils. We want to get the best teak we can at our site, because that's what people plant in Panama. There's a lot of off-site teak, as we call it, planted. So we aren't particularly worried about this. But if you want to make a lot of money and you play it out, and it's pretty much at this age, there's not a lot more you can do to change that growth trajectory. You're not going to be able to jump this up to here and get much better growth. And at this rate, with the financial analysis we've done, it will barely pay for itself without any discount rate or anything over 20 years. So you'll be lucky if you get, it's not here you get your 2006 or 2008 dollars back at an interest rate of whatever it would be. But you put $50 in today, you're lucky if you get just $50 out back then. So people aren't stupid. It's good to know. they didn't plant this whole area up with teak, and that's what people knew how to manage at that time. So, and the reason is because we have this really low fertility soils here. And so these plantations aren't this is the barrier for it, for these really low fertility soils, and our site's on that kind of site. And so the shame of it is people have known how to manage teak for 100 years, and they know that it needs certain kind of soils, and we know that these are not the right kind of soils. So, well, people didn't plant it. But we would say not all hope is lost, because here we have our own Terminalia amazonia, which is a species, a native species that has been sold at the same value, at least in a example sale, at the same value as teak, and it has a lot of the same properties that teak has. So we're getting really good growth without any fertilization or any extra effort from our Terminalia plantations. And here, if this is at the same value and has the same growth trajectory, which it has perhaps even better, you can make a lot of money on that. So if you need to make money planting your trees, well, that's really good. If cocoa bolo, well, I told you, maybe it grows a little slower than this, it does, but it pretty much grows the same on good sites or bad sites. If it's worth $4,000 a cubic meter, you can wait a little longer to make that kind of money, right? So plant it out, and so there are species that we've learned a lot about, and others are learning about too, that could be used to reforest. And so since we've talked about the importance of soil infiltration, roots and tree plantations, we're not just talking about a timber benefit that one could get here. All right, biodiversity. We spend a lot of time looking at biodiversity in Panama. Panama forests are really rich. I mean, you hear about the path between the seas of the Panama Canal, but the Panama as a country is the bridge between the Americas, right? And so there are lots of species that have come from North and South America that intermix in there. Ecotourism, though it's not been quantified in Panama as its value, is a big deal. I mean, a lot of birders go to Panama and others. We're also interested in the importance of biodiversity on ecosystem function. This is a map of what we call the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor, which is a notion that was probably 2 decades old, but to try to keep some sort of forest all the way from South America, all the way through Panama, all the way up through to Mexico, and keep this corridor. So large-bodied, wide-ranging species can have areas to move in for, have viable populations, genetic diversity exchange, and in climate change, if species have to move, they have to have corridors to move in. We are in what amounts to be the most fragile part of the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor in Panama, and so we are hoping that our research, of course, will influence how to reforest this or how to manage this area for biodiversity and maintain that corridor. We've spent a lot of time on our effort. We have done lots of inventories. These red lines here, these are all around pastures. This is the landscape matrix. We spent a lot of time quantifying vegetation, but birds and bats and small mammals in these areas to see how valuable these pastures might be. This orange here, this would be our secondary forest area, and of course we have these plots all over our landscape where we're looking at different ages of secondary forest, and we've developed all these equations. They're highly diverse. We have, in our 10 hectares of plots, we have 600 species of trees and lianas in 10 hectares, which is at a landscape scale, so it's not like having just one big plot. But I had a colleague here, Stuart Davies, who came here and spoke at the Kansas City Library, I guess, a month or two ago, and he talks about these big plots. Well, they only have 300 species in their big plot of 50 hectares on BCI. So it's a little bit apples and oranges because of sampling, but these are really full of floristic diversity, secondary forests. And you can see here, well, gosh, this is a living fence. This could be a biological corridor for certain animals, birds that move through. We certainly know monkey species that will use living fences to get from one place to the area, so to the next. So if we can have some sort of spatial juxtaposition of land use, maybe we can have a more biodiversity-friendly landscape. So here's our map again from 2008. Our focus area, of course, is in this Agua Salud area, and this is where we have our big research here. We've inventoried and projected all the way out here to this highway, and we're now working with a cement company, Argos, which turns out, I didn't know this, but Argos is one of the biggest cement producers in the United States as well. Argos has cement here, and they're here because there's limestone there, so they have different soils than these really infertile here, and they have these plantations on both sides of the highway, and this is the Inter-American Highway. And that's important because with this big urbanization front, and this is from 2008, it looks a lot worse now. If you have stable land ownership on both sides of the highway, there's the ability for species to get from A to B, to get across the road. And we've been inventorying these plantations, which includes some teak, includes native species plantations, and we found that they're just full of bats, for example. We had thousands of 3,000 bats in a relatively small sampling period. 37 species of bats there on Barrow, Colorado Island, where we've been capturing bats, or not me, but people have been for over 30 years. There's 75 species, but we have half the bat diversity, and just with the species diversity can go up with more sampling. So we have lots of that, lots of birds in here and small mammals, including we've captured with our camera traps people. We have one guy who's sitting there looking into the camera, trying to break into the camera trap, and we got this big, beautiful photo of his mug. Go figure, yeah. He didn't get the camera trap, but we got him. So this whole idea of looking at wise land management, connecting up to Chagres Park through here, or maybe down through here, Ciudad del Arbol, and looking at ways of managing the land, including silvipastoral systems, the spatial to keep the corridor so that these Chagres National Park and Sobernie here are not separated forever. And so we're working with them, and the nice thing about this particular company is that they're willing to convert these areas and do restoration treatments and manipulations to make them more biodiversity favorable. And so we're busy working on that with them. So what was it? Science, commerce, and sustainability. So we hit the commerce there. I mean, you're convinced that the canal is big and important. But the future of the canal and the future of really any watershed in the tropics is that it really depends on all of the stakeholders. Sustainability, there's lots of people and actors that have to derive livelihoods and get some sort of benefit off of watersheds. And we're looking at these different land uses, and we're doing some of the deep science to try to figure out, how to manage co-benefits, or we call bundling of ecosystem services together, which ones go together, which ones are mutually exclusive, and trying to make predictions on the best way to manage land. We also realize that, I talked about water, carbon, biodiversity. We're looking at timber, there's agriculture, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of other things on the landscape that we look at. And of course, as I said, we're measuring these things. We're working with the Panama Canal Authority and the National Environmental Authority and others to, suggest different land uses and models and spatial juxtaposition of land use, suggest how to restore target areas. But also then on the science side, trying to figure out how does the ecosystem function for these water benefits? How does this infiltration and sponge, how does that work? Because hydrological models that are used now are not meant to predict 20 years, they're lucky if they do 5 years, 5 days into the future. So we need to predict, and we just recently, were very fortunate, we received a big NSF grant it's called Water Sustainability and Climate, and NSF there, in their grant writing, outline, they say, look, we know the hydrological models that exist, that are there, don't work. So you don't need to spend your, 15 pages of your grant telling us why these models don't work. We accept that. We want to know what you're going to do and how you're going to get to helping to build new hydrological models. So that's what on that side we're doing, but we're looking at forest dynamic models and secondary forests, how they get organized and produce carbon and good things for biodiversity and all that. So we have different levels, layers of the onion, if you will, of what we're doing. And then, of course, we all are hoping for that our science will impact, sustainable solutions. Really, it's a big, brave world that we live in, and so we believe that we need science, since its best instance should inform management and wise decisions. It doesn't always happen politically, but that's what we're about. So, thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a few questions. Raise your hands. I'll come by with a microphone. And anyone watching from our worldwide audience watching live stream, if you type in a question, we'll get to those too. Yes, sir.
I'm interested, going back to the building of the canal and the difference between average rainfall and rainfall that threatens the infrastructure. And did they actually have people who studied this, hydrology and the forest and the rainfall, before they built these dams to figure that out, or did they just get lucky?
Well, I mean, I don't know for sure, but obviously we have 120, 30 years worth of rainfall records constantly. This is one of the best documented watersheds there exists, and stream flow that have been going ever since then. It's, you could spend 30 years doing a preliminary study. They didn't do that, obviously. And one of the reasons, of course, they had these big landslides is they didn't really understand what drives landslides, and that it's really the angle of repose, and they had to remove all of this extra soil. And they obviously had a huge problem in constructing the canal with all these big storms and things that they had. So I think they just soldiered through for the most part. And then they did have problems along the way.
Specification of the dam, how high they built it?
I don't know what drove that. By the time they built Alajuela or Madden Dam, they did have 30 years worth of rainfall record. But so they did know something about and be able to make good predictions. And the Army Corps and the Bureau of Land Management, they're good at building dams. I mean, they did a darn good job, and they're still here. Dams are built really with a 50-year life cycle, right? That's what they're thought. And these things are 100 years already. I mean, economists will, think about it in terms of that, and they've lasted a long time. So they did a pretty amazing job.
Jeff, here on your right.
I'm interested in learning if you've been able to, your research in Panama, to have any direct relationship to what we're doing in the United States or North America.
Well, there's certainly, the U.S. Geological Survey does a lot of hydrology. There's a lot more going on in the Americas for a long time. There have been these kind of ecosystem studies. Hubbard Brook is a great one, started in the late 1960s in New Hampshire, looking at these ecosystem effects of forested and things like that. We would argue that, in the tropics, at some level, things change much more rapidly. We don't have a big, we don't have a winter. Or cold season. But, I have a sister-in-law who manages the water for the city of Tacoma, Washington, and their sponge is the snowpack, right? So they have different kinds of issues in terms of that. So I think that the biggest application, our work goes all across the tropics, and that's where we're building these models and trying to understand. And in the world we live in today, anything that happens, poverty in Africa can affect our doorstep tomorrow. And certainly the canal, though, we might wake up every day and think that everybody in America knows the Panama Canal. Of course they don't, but it does affect what they have maybe on their table, or certainly a lot of goods they get from China, Asia, whatever. So.
You talked about low fertility soils. Are there any things that can be done to increase the fertility of the soil? And are you looking at those types of things?
Well, yes. Fertilizers will, but it's super expensive, right? And so for planting trees, you'd really have to have a really high value product to do that. So that's where we're looking at what combination of trees, maybe nitrogen fixers or others will kind of help reboot, that's the simple phrase we like to say for public talks, but the ecosystem in terms of nutrient cycling. So we certainly learned a lot about these nitrogen fixers, and we know that the forest couldn't have this rapid regrowth without this group of species. And that was really counterintuitive, because people have believed for a long time that tropical forests, their growth is limited by phosphorus, which is another plant macronutrient, and that temperate forests are limited by nitrogen. And so we were able to show this and show the importance in species identity. So in that sense, we're looking at the combinations of trees that we can put together that will grow on these infertile sites and will slowly reaccumulate the nutrient stocks and the above ground biomass, really.
Hey, back here. I'm a technologist, and so consequently I'm constantly interacting with computers, robotics, and so on and so forth. The reason I bring that up is you talked about the cost per hectare of reforestation and the price of that. How are you going about doing that, and have you looked at the research being done in the United States with regards to utilizing drones to actually do reforestation in the United States?
Well, so we do, I do have a colleague who's working with drones, but when I say, I call them unarmed aerial vehicles, they are unarmed, but that's not what they're meant to be. They're unmanned. She's looking at phenology and changes in leaf turnover is one of the ways you can look at forest productivity. You can't, because of all the granivores, the animals and things that will eat all the seeds off the ground, you're not going to go very far trying to reforest by just spreading seeds. You really have to plant seedlings there, and you have to get them a good start. So people who have done just the seeding method have not succeeded. I'm unaware of anybody who's actually succeeded in that level, and that's because all the rodents and everybody who comes in for to eat. So we haven't tried that in that aspect, and I'm a little skeptical, though. Of course, who knows? Maybe it would work. I'd love to learn more about how they do that, though.
Dr. Hall, in many tropical areas, soils, once the deforestation has taken place, change in their nature. Laterite, for example. Do we have this problem in Panama? And if so, is there a natural progression, like a fire-dominant forest in, say, the Pacific Northwest, where we could restart that sort of cycle?
So there is... The actual production, I'm not a soil scientist, but I think there's a little bit of, in terms of laterization, there's a little bit of discussion of how that comes to be or not. We certainly have nutrient leaching, and we certainly have, when you remove the topsoil, what little there is, which is mostly the nutrient stock, is there. And we in Panama certainly have some highly degraded, if you will, soils, or really nutrient poor, that suffer from erosion, even sheet erosion in gullies and all that are a real challenge. And so, and we have the fire problem absolutely in reforestation. And this year, because of the really dry, wet season right now we're having in Central America for the most part, there's obviously a big fire season in California right now, but we could see something pretty awful in Nicaragua and Guatemala in terms of their forests and stuff. But we have in reforestation, that's a big challenge of just trying to keep people from burning. And we haven't, but the fires haven't been extensive and pervasive enough to seem to have done something to the soil, but I can't say for sure. Certainly you can have hydrophobic soils with fires and things like that. I think the challenge, so that we do approach it from the reforestation, trying to find the species that will grow there. And it could be something like a pine or something that people use those as nurse trees. There have been great research done in all over the tropics where people have planted pine plantations, not because they want that, but because that kind of helps to kind of reboot things. And so we are looking at these areas of what might grow best, but that's really the way we're approaching it.
I'm just curious, Panama, of course, is a small country. Israel is a small country, and 60 years ago, it was rock and sand, mostly. They went on a project, it's still going on, planting hundreds of millions of trees. They didn't try anything new, just took the native trees and continued to plant more of them. Do you see any comparison there or anything useful that grew out of that experience in Israel?
Well, I mean, we have not looked at Israeli experience per se, but what we do know is that people lost a lot of money by just planting whatever there is out there. One of the big problems is, so because it costs so much, you can't, will it grow there? Is it shade intolerant? I mean, does it need a lot of light to grow? Will it be just burned by full sunlight? And how do you manage that to begin with? So we're trying to learn about these basic silvicultural characteristics, as we call them, about what to plant out, what might work. And so we've taken, to begin with, 75 native species, which includes not just timber, but things that people use for different reasons or not. And we've had a lot of, in our own plantations, one of the things we learned is that they just never should be grown in full sunlight. But that's important to know. I mean, we found them on Barrow Colorado Island, we found them in some different place. And so to figuring out kind of what grows earliest enough. So that's why people are planting teak in places, because it looks impressionable. You can get a teak tree that could look kind of big in a few years, but it's actually not. Doesn't turn out it's going to be worth very much. Anyway, so that's where we're at. We haven't really looked at, and the Israeli experience, I guess, is more dryland. And I know some people an Israeli group that has in Honduras, before they had the coup, was looking at planting teak and managing it on 7-year rotations. And they used the micro drip irrigation systems with nutrients from Israel and all that. And then, of course, well, they had to leave. But, yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hall, for the wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And thank you for attending tonight's event. In 2 weeks is the David McCullough Lecture. We are fully booked for that. We've even had to close the wait list, so if you have tickets, I'll see you in 2 weeks. If not, we still have plenty of room at our other upcoming lectures this fall. So thank you again, and good night.